zero or very liberal restrictions around facial recognition usage. And so we end up seeing a scenario in which in certain cities, facial recognition technologies or software-based facial recognition, for example, doesn't even require a warrant or, a sort of a serious sort of suspicion that has been passed through some form of protocol in order to be run against a particular person. And so we end up seeing situations where protesters who are exercising, their right to protest and to assemble, targeted, having their faces run through software-based facial recognition, having them found. So what a police officer might be able to do, for example, with facial recognition software, is to find someone's presence elsewhere, find out information about them through the various different social media links that might pop up as a result of running their face on facial recognition. And what it also does is that it sort of creates a barrier for protesters to be able to freely exercise their right to protest in future, right? Because there is a chilling effect. And so we see in particular Black and brown communities affected by facial recognition. We see effectively also facial recognition being used against undocumented communities. But again, I'm in really fantastic company today, and I'm sure that there are lots of other ways in which this manifests that my colleagues can speak more to. I see Anushka has her hand up as well.
If I can just jump in here, now that we're talking about protesting. So in New Delhi, what is happening is extremely problematic also because New Delhi is unique in the sense that it is the national capital territory of India, but it's also a union territory. So it has its own state government, but it's where the central government is. So there are multiple jurisdictions that are converging on New Delhi. So there are multiple projects that are happening in New Delhi. The most problematic is the Delhi police's use of facial recognition. So how Delhi police got facial recognition itself is, and how they're using it is something that is very interesting to think about, because they got it through High Court judgment in which the court said that you can use facial recognition to unite missing children. But now the Delhi police has committed this big function creep wherein Delhi police is now using facial recognition on protesters. They're using it to identify suspects in investigations. In the last year, the Delhi police has conducted a total of 18,968 FRE scans throughout the city, and they have arrested or identified as suspects multiple people in New Delhi based on facial recognition. This has happened for the Northeast Delhi riots. This has happened for the violence that was there in New Delhi recently in 2021 at the Red Fort. This has happened during the anti-CAA protests that happened in December 2019. This has happened during the farmers' protests, which are ongoing right now in New Delhi. So there are a lot of situations in which the Delhi police is using facial recognition, but is also using it for not just for these events, but also normally, and conducting scans and making arrests through facial recognition. One of the things that the Delhi police use is problematic is also because their accuracy rate is so low. In an affidavit that they submitted, they said that the accuracy rate is 2%, and the technology cannot differentiate between female and male children. So that is the facial recognition technology that they're using to arrest people in New Delhi. Another thing, so this is happening under the central government, but the state government is also doing problematic things wherein the state government has installed facial recognition for some reason in multiple government schools in New Delhi, in the classrooms. That is something that is ongoing. I think I should let somebody else speak now, because I can just go on and on. But yes, there are a lot of ways in which the use of facial recognition is happening in New Delhi right now.
And I think I'm really struck by a couple points of similarity to the situation in New York and a couple areas of divergence. So I'm so jealous that you were able to get that accuracy data. So here in New York, we submitted an open records request for any records from the NYPD on the accuracy and bias of their facial recognition system, and they denied it. They refused to provide any records. We appealed it. They denied it again. We're getting ready to sue them in state court. And so that level of transparency and having more accurate information about the numbers of cases where it's being used is really a striking difference. But at the same time, I think we see this similar pattern of the facial recognition being justified using these really horrifying acts of violence, and then you see this mission creep where then it's expanded and it's expanded. And I think this really speaks to something that's true with a lot of surveillance, that there's a fixed economic and political cost buying the systems up front, and then once you've done that, you have this institutional incentive to just use it more frequently to justify the fact you already bought it. And we saw that very starkly here in New York with Clearview AI, where records from the Legal Aid Society showed that they were, this vendor Clearview AI was encouraging officers to, quote, don't just run 1 or 2 searches, run 100, just using that sort of bulk surveillance as a selling point. So I think that pattern is very interesting to observe.
Matt.
Yeah, and I think to that point as well, facial recognition is, and Albert has spoken to this extensively too in some op-eds. It's a global phenomenon. The way that we see it used, in particular, against as Anushka has also talked about, protesters, but also almost consistently across all the cases that we look at Amnesty, whether it's the West Bank, whether it's in India, whether it's in New York, or whether it's in Ulaanbaatar, is against minority communities, or as we know about, and have heard of in the media extensively about the usage of facial recognition against Uyghur minority Muslim communities in China. Again, minority communities become kind of the testing ground for this technology, which not only lacks a huge amount of transparency from the side of law enforcement, but that even when transparency exists, are still incredibly harmful, right? And I think like one point that we should probably talk about at some point, and I'd love to hear from colleagues on this, is also like that even if facial recognition was accurate and say like it was 99.9% accurate, it's still problematic for a number of reasons, including the fact that it still augments existing discriminatory practices, and that it doesn't address fundamental injustices in the criminal justice system. But I will leave it to colleagues to weigh in on this.
If I might, I would just to add to what Matt shared. In addition to the biases that it perpetuates, there's also the concern that any use of the technology will also have a chilling effect on essential fundamental freedoms, right? So if you're concerned that if you go to a protest where you might explore and hear new ideas that you may not even hold those ideas, or maybe you do, maybe you're there in support and solidarity with the community that the protest is there to support. In any event, if it is an unpopular idea with authorities, the concern and the chilling effect and the way that it would diminish your likelihood to engage in that very important activity is a problem, even if the technology worked 100%. The idea that, as you visit your religious institution, as you go to a medical clinic, as you walk around the streets with your partner, that could be tracked and potentially shared with folks that might use it in a way that would have adverse effects on you, and the way that it would change the way we engage in society is a problem, even if the technology worked appropriately and accurately. Well, I don't think it could work appropriately, but even if it worked accurately for all, for men, for women, for darker skin, for younger folks, for elderly, those would still be effects that can't be separated from the technologies used by government.
Thank you all. One question, since we're on a global panel, tell me more about the targeting of minority communities outside of the US context. What does that look like in India? What does it look like in Ulaanbaatar? What is it? May I ask Anushka?
Yes, definitely. So as I was saying that the Delhi police is using facial recognition during protests and during violence that happens during these protests. So when the anti-CAA protests were happening, they were happening, and there was a certain section of the Indian society, a certain religion, which was being targeted, and that was the religion that was protesting. Because the Citizenship Amendment Act, as the Indian Parliament is moving forward with it, will exclude a certain religion from citizenship in India. So using facial recognition technology during these protests automatically targets this religion and the people who think that people who belong to this religion are correct in protesting. So not just the people who belong to the that section of the society, but also people who are supporting them are being targeted by facial recognition when it's being used at protests. The same thing happened during the farmers' protests in New Delhi. So the farmers' protests are mainly happening, the people who are protesting are mainly from the region in which farming is happening in India, which is the Punjab area. And using facial recognition on these protest sites will automatically target this section of the society. So that is what is happening in India, wherein because facial recognition is being used by the police as a crowd management technology during protests, and because these protests are obviously being conducted by people who are in a minority, and that is because they're being excluded, they are protesting. The effect of this technology is being felt disproportionately by people who belong to these minority communities.
Very helpful. So anyone who has an interest in protesting and upsetting the status quo in fighting for their rights in a given context is susceptible to targeting with facial recognition. Matt?
Yeah, and to add to that a little bit, I think there's also sort of a race to the bottom of technologies that are adjacent to facial recognition, but that very much follow the same line of thinking and are also underpinned by the disciplines of phrenology and physiognomy and its emotion recognition, of course. Again, you have a scenario with facial recognition in which if you're protesting, if you're dissenting, you will be subject to facial recognition. With emotion recognition, the idea of criminality by detection is built into the system, right? That you can somehow scientifically detect whether someone is a criminal or whether someone has done something illegal through the capture of their faces becomes a natural conclusion of the overuse or even just the use of facial recognition. So I would argue to some extent, not only are you as a protester at risk of being subjected to facial recognition, which harms your rights and freedoms, as Nash has also pointed out, there is also something to be said about, what happens after facial recognition. Like, what are we permitting through not taking action against banning facial recognition? And the next thing that comes, will be much worse, whether it's emotion recognition or whatever else it might be.
Thank you. Let me pivot a little bit and ask why you're pursuing regulation at the local level and how that connects with national or global changes.
Well, I think our entire model at S.T.O.P is to, push for these changes at the local level, because we've seen, a stalemate, a logjam, pick your metaphor, in DC for so many decades. And we think that, we see these transformative campaigns unfolding at the local level, and it can build, growing momentum towards, norms, across the US and across the world, and build. And that's, I think, how we get towards the larger national bans.
Matt?
I think to Albert's point, I think there's a realization that's coming amongst larger human rights organizations as well, including my own Amnesty, which is that, you know, we can only do so much at the global level, especially in terms of binding enforceable law. So obviously there is such a thing as international human rights law, but the extent to which it can be enforced is always in question. And so in terms of immediately protecting people who are at risk with things like facial recognition, our strategy has been a more devolved approach, because we need action immediately, because these technologies are being used, and we need sort of legislative action that is likely to stay put, and something that people can't just remove themselves from in the long term. So whilst, again, international human rights law does provide a framework for thinking about some of these injustices in a global sense, we really need to act locally without sounding super cliche, and to pass legislation at the national and the hyperlocal city level as well.
So I've heard two things so far. Why pursue local action? Because you have to, right? Because it's the only alternative. And then in some cases to set a precedent for other local communities and maybe ultimately national regulation. Let me ask you then, what is the state of facial recognition laws in the cities and countries where you work? What do we already have on the books? And what do you most need in the communities where you work in the way of facial recognition laws?
I can go, but I think I am monopolizing the time. I think there are two other people who have not had the chance to speak.
We so rarely get to hear anything about India and facial recognition, so please.
Okay, so in India, there are no specific laws with regard to facial recognition. It is happening without any law, legislation, any authority, legislative authority in place. There is no wider data protection law in India. There are no strong surveillance provisions which can tackle facial recognition technology used by the government in India. So everything that is happening with regard to facial recognition, from the Delhi police using facial recognition to the central government building what is supposed to be the world's largest facial recognition system, the Indian system that they're building, everything is happening in a legal vacuum. What we do have is the right to privacy decision, which our Supreme Court passed in Puttaswamy versus Union of India. And that stated that all Indians have the fundamental right to privacy, and any intrusion by the state into this privacy has to satisfy certain thresholds, which is legality, which means there should be an existence of law, which there isn't. Necessity, which means that it should be done for a legitimate state goal or aim, which we don't think it is, because it's not accurate, so it cannot identify people. So it will not fulfill that state aim of identifying people. If they think it's going to do that, it's not. Proportionality is the third threshold, which says that the intrusion should satisfy the state aim, which is not doing, and there should be no alternative to it. We feel that there are multiple alternatives to facial recognition. It is not necessary for security surveillance purposes or for authentication of identity purposes. And the last thing is that procedural guarantees should be in place to check against the abuse of state interference, which is not happening. There are no procedural guarantees in India which will protect against misuse of facial recognition. So in an ideal world, what we would want the government to do is ban facial recognition for all purposes in India. But realistically, what we can hope is a specific facial recognition technology regulation in India, a wider strong data protection law in India, as well as strong provisions which regulate surveillance by the government in India, which there aren't currently.
I want to cut in to say that I have not been able to see Ángel when he raises his hand. And so I'd like to pass the mic over to you, and also to let you know that I can't see when you're raising your hand, so please cut in whenever you have anything to say. And I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I think we're seeing a lot of different cities ban facial recognition, and maybe I'll go about answering this question with the one you asked before, which is each community has different needs and different sort of lived experiences that sort of inform why they think facial recognition shouldn't be used. I think some communities are closer to the tech industry and understand how often these tools are sort of pushed quickly and don't work and are more skeptical. In other jurisdictions, there's much more concern also about the use of private facial recognition. So in places like Portland, it's not just the police that can't use it, but certain businesses that function as public accommodations also aren't able to use it, and sort of perhaps have a somewhat of a forward-looking approach to the reality that this technology might be normalized by police, but will certainly not be only used by police. And there is a similar risk that a lot of the uses of facial recognition might be used to sort of reintroduce a lot of civil rights violations that we thought we had addressed way back when we sort of said businesses can't exclude people on the basis of certain characteristics. Facial recognition kind of helps you bring that back in similar ways to the way the police do, which is to sort of say that they're not being racist. There's just this justification based on data that says that this person is too risky to allow. And so I think certain jurisdictions are starting to think about that. Others are sort of primarily focused on facial recognition at the policing level. But I think that the policing level is a reasonable place to focus, because it's one of these things where we have already a handful of examples of people who are being falsely arrested because of these matches. And it doesn't matter that there's a human in the loop. It doesn't matter that there are other ways of sort of evaluating what was wrong about it. The reality is that the tool is to sort of use to justify over policing. And so it's happening already. And it really begs the question of whose life matters. If we're just sort of saying, oh, it's okay, we might catch more criminals, so we're going to just sort of subject these particular communities to more over policing. And I think that it's one of the big reasons that I think it starts at policing.
Anyone else on the state of local regulation where they work?
Well, one thing I was wondering about from Matt is whether you're seeing any sort of movement with devolved governments in the UK, and sort of how that's being approached as a UK-wide regulatory question versus a more local or regional issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think some of you will be familiar with the case of South Wales Police using live facial recognition in the United Kingdom, in which it was ruled that they could not, in fact, use facial recognition because it fell under a violation of a number of different principles, including privacy and, of course, equality. The Essex Human Rights and Big Data team at the University of Essex, also released a report extensively outlining this before the case. What was interesting there is that there was an expectation that the police might follow up with an appeal to the ruling, and they did not. So that's been really interesting to see at the devolved level in Wales. But what's also equally, of course, discouraging is to see how the pandemic moment, of course, has been a moment in which facial recognition, in particular, following clampdown on assemblies and protest under the justification of observing social distancing, has been further justified, right? And so, like, we're going to see, as this country starts opening up, the rollout of facial recognition in venues where people might find themselves, whether it's a pharmacy or whether it's a bar or the cafes. But also we're seeing it increasingly used in the streets, which of course was already the case following the Big Brother reporting a couple of years ago. But it's very disturbing to see. I'm not sure if you all followed, but in the wake of the murder of Sarah Everard, there were a number of attempts at breaking up peaceful assemblies by police. And again, this was not a march. This was a peaceful assembly, which is allowed under the current regulation, even under pandemic conditions. And following that, there has been a report, and of course, this bill that is now being passed in order to curb the right to protest and assembly, which also introduces the further usage of facial recognition. So whilst we've seen progressive movements in say Wales, England in particular is not doing so hot right now, if I may put it that way, on facial recognition.
Ask a related question to the other panelists. So what we're hearing from Matt is that the pandemic is exacerbating problems around facial recognition because police are clamping down on protests. Are there other ways in which the pandemic is making facial recognition worse or increasing its use in the cities where you work?
I mean, I think what.
No, go.
Please.
I mean, I think at a high level, there's just the overall concern that during the pandemic, there's more of a sort of shared understanding that there needs to be some restrictions in place as we think about movement. And the concern is that facial recognition will be sort of thought about as a essential component of trying to reopen cities. And I think that that's one of the big risks that we have to keep in mind, in that there may be some restrictions that make sense, but we need to resist the idea that every movement you make in public space being sort of restricted or identifiable by police. It's one of these things where I like to think about it in terms of when you have neighbors and one neighbor wants to sort of expand their yard, so they start to mow their grass a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. We're seeing that happen in the public spaces where under the guise of pandemic security, we're seeing more and more of the public space be sort of claimed by police, and sort of encroaching more and more on how you can move, and sort of saying that anytime that you're outside of your door, and sometimes even when you're inside of it, you are subject to like public surveillance.
Anushka.
So in India, at least, we've seen a lot of proliferation of not just facial recognition, but surveillance technology in general. There was the S.T.O.P app, which is collecting location data. But facial recognition specifically has been increasing at a massive level in India, from the use of facial recognition to identify people who are not wearing masks, to now recently what the government has done is the government has allowed facial recognition to be used as a method of authentication of identity for access to vaccines in India, which is something that is extremely problematic, also because it is in conjunction with an already problematic surveillance project in India, which is the Aadhaar project in India. So the government has said that Aadhaar-based facial recognition will be used for authentication of identity for access to vaccines. And this is extremely problematic because Aadhaar itself is extremely exclusionary. It has led to starvation deaths, and facial recognition as well is extremely exclusionary. In this situation, if the facial recognition does not identify you, you would lose out on getting vaccinated against coronavirus, which is something that is India is at like a very bad situation right now with regard to the pandemic. So creating these hurdles for access to vaccines is something which the government should not do. They should prioritize access to vaccines and make it as simple as possible, but they're not doing this for some reason that we fail to understand. And IFF with a bunch of other amazing organizations which work on the Aadhaar project as well as public health. The organizations are Rethink Aadhaar and Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, as well as a group of volunteers. We also released a joint statement in which we said that this use should be stopped. It should not be done because people will lose out on access to vaccines. But this is also something that is happening in India, wherein facial recognition is being used not just in a normal way, but also in a way which will increase the harms that we are already suffering in the pandemic.
So if I may, what I'm hearing from Ángel and from Anushka is that surveillance, including facial recognition, is becoming normalized as a way of opening up safely, as a normal way of showing up and identifying yourself to get a vaccine? Thank you.
So I just wanted to say that, we seem to be seeing, anonymity dying a slow death. And I think that erosion has accelerated quite rapidly during COVID-19. And I think that if we reach a place where we are constantly being tracked by other means, then some of the most central harms of facial recognition will then be eroded. I mean, they'll seem less salient because we'll see all of these other ways that we're being tracked in the same way.
Thank you. Let me remind the audience members that we will be taking your questions soon. You can enter those using the Q&A function at the bottom of the page. I was going to say, to Albert's point, that sounds very familiar, right? Emergency situations, new technologies or practices are introduced. And then once the emergency is gone, that practice still remains with us. Let me ask, since Albert is on the mic, what is Ban the Scan? What does it look like in its local form? What is the global Ban the Scan campaign?
Yeah, so Ban the Scan is an effort to sort of take that model of building on local wins to have global impact and, trying to operationalize it in a number of cities, New York being the first, where you have, local groups here in New York, including Ángel and the Brennan Center, which are, working to ban facial recognition across the city and across the state. But then that work is then amplified through the amazing partnership with Amnesty International, who developed the entire campaign and has driven it from the start, and is really creating this incredible opportunity to build bridges with local groups, all around the world. They're, fighting the exact same vendors, fighting the exact same technology, fighting the same fight, but just in very different local communities with very different political dynamics. And I feel like Matt would be much better positioned than I am to go into further detail.
Tell us about it, Matt.
I think Albert did it a lot of justice. I don't think I could have said it any better myself. I think for us, it was very important that what we did was connect existing efforts as opposed to going in and starting a global campaign that in and of itself, again, like played in a lot of rhetoric, but didn't necessarily advance much. And I think what is important is that activists feel that they have a larger coalition around them across the globe, and that we can take learnings on the research front as well, whether it's as Albert's saying, whether it's about the vendors or whether it's about the ways they might be used. That way also sort of acting as a warning sign for what we might expect in a particular context to emerge in the near future, right? Based on what we've experienced in another place. So yeah, I don't have much more to add other than keeping on nerding out about it. I will say though that the Ban the Scan campaign, it's come up to its sort of second phase where, beyond having, of course, this local push on the New York City Council in particular, and also the state Senate, we've launched an effort called Decode Surveillance NYC, where we're asking anybody to come on board and help us tag CCTV camera infrastructures that plug into facial recognition software in New York City. And so, if you're sitting at home and wondering how you can get involved with doing anti-surveillance work, in particular anti-facial recognition work, you can go to decoders.amnesty.org, and you can help us literally tag facial recognition, CCTV cameras. And the way that's done is you're thrown into a Google Street View image, an intersection across New York City, and you just keep tagging and you get thrown into another intersection. So there are many ways for us to get involved with this effort. But yeah, sorry, I've been blabbing for a little while now.
Not at all. Let me ask a question. Ban the Scan is premised on the idea that there should be no use of facial recognition by police. Is there any legitimate use of facial recognition tools by police or government agencies, and why or why not? For anyone.
I'm happy to quickly talk to, no. So there's no legitimate use of facial recognition. Part of it is that we often get into these cases where the police will point to something out of a bad action movie where they're talking about these scenarios that aren't happening in real life and saying how if only we had facial recognition, we could stop, this bad remake of 24 from taking place, that we could stop the threat from materializing. But what we've seen in practice is we don't have the structures in place, either within police departments, within municipalities, within the legal system, to differentiate between those uses and the misuse, the systematic targeting of communities of color for low-level offenses, for poverty. And so what you end up with is if you give an inch, you give a mile. Because, essentially when we allow any use of this technology, we're putting discretion in the hands of a racist, law enforcement apparatus and racist judiciary to try to tell us what are the good cases and what are the bad cases. And oftentimes we end up with tragedy.
And what I would add to that is, in many places we have requirements of like what police need to do if they want to search your home, if they want to search your vehicle, if they want to search your belongings, right? We have those requirements. Is there an argument that could be made that if we just removed all of those protections for civil liberties, all of those privacy protections, that there might be some increased level of a police ability to prevent or stop certain crimes? Maybe. But we've made a decision in many of our nations a long time ago that we need to balance protecting essential freedoms and respecting essential rights with that potential impact on public safety, right? And that public safety requires trust between law enforcement, the people charged with protecting the public safety, and the people in the community. And so when you start to violate, when you start to use a technology like face surveillance that has such dire and inseparable impact on those freedoms, we've in keeping with that history and those holdings, in the U.S. and in our Bill of Rights that says, that we hold these liberties so high that we want to increase the barrier and we want to increase the level of protection. We want to increase the responsibility of police to justify that kind of search, right? We would not allow police to simply stop anyone on the street and say, we want to, show me your ID, person, or tell people that they have to wear a tag on their outer clothing that says their name and where they live, right? We wouldn't accept that, right? And so, and face surveillance is potentially even more pernicious than that because it's done covertly. At least if a police officer had to stop me on the street and say, give me your ID for no given reason, I would know that was happening. I could challenge it. I could, call attention to it. But with face surveillance, it happens covertly, and there's no way that we would even know how often and how the level at which it is impacting, the level of which we're being monitored. And so that is why, the balance, there's no way to appropriately strike that balance. And therefore it's required to ban the government use of the technology.
Ángel or Anushka?
I don't really have much to add to that. I think Nash did it really well.
Okay, so what I heard then was that, practically speaking, from Albert, there's no opening the gate a little without opening to all sorts of uses of facial recognition. And then from Nash, on a principled point, no, you can't have facial recognition without giving up protections on basic freedoms. So there is a little bit of facial recognition for public safety, unless you want to undermine democratic norms.
I just want to make one little point here. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I completely agree with what Nash said. In India, this is even more problematic because, like I said, it is happening in a legal vacuum. There is nothing that is regulating use of facial recognition in India. Like I told you, the Delhi police is conducting facial recognition scans on the street. They've done it more than around 17,000 scans in the last, from August till March, I think. So just imagine the level of intrusion of privacy that is happening in India and the level of harm that is happening in India right now. Because in addition to facial recognition itself being problematic in as much as it is inaccurate, in as much as it violates the right to privacy, there is no way for a person to do anything about it because there are no laws in India to regulate this. So this is what is happening in India, at least.
ask a question from the audience related to public engagement and public understanding that might eventually percolate up to more regulation. This is a question from Emily Leone, and she asks, what have you seen in terms of work to get public understanding of this issue elevated? And what do you see as missing in getting public engagement on the harms associated with facial recognition?
Jump in. I mean, I think that what's been the most impactful are individual stories of things happening, right? And so part of what's difficult is how invisible a lot of what's happening can be, and how what's most dangerous is that some of the most serious impacts of policing and the way it works most efficiently is when it's out of sight. And so people really very much need to sort of see the impact. So we're starting to see a few examples. Like I mentioned, folks in New Jersey and Detroit who have been falsely arrested for a faulty facial recognition match. We've seen tenants in Brooklyn organize against facial recognition being installed in their apartment complexes. Those are the sort of real stories that sort of make clear what's at risk. Here in New York, we also saw police use social media monitoring and facial recognition to identify a protester and harass him with a whole army of police officers outside of his home for hours on end. These stories are not always, it's very easy to sort of see that story and without digging deeper, not realize that facial recognition played a role in all these individual stories. So there's a lot more education that needs to be done, but I think it's changing pretty quickly. There are, there's the Coded Bias documentary on Netflix, which walks through a lot of the sort of efforts to push back against the use of this technology and sort of documenting a lot of the harms. I think that one of the big issues that I think happens with this technology and with a lot of technologies is just that communities of color are not really thought about in the development of them. And so the tools oftentimes don't work for them. And it usually, unfortunately, takes somebody who has lived an experience to sort of say, I don't think that's going to work the way you say it does. And I think, even something as simple as like Face ID, it hardly ever works for me, but everyone sort of uses it as an example of like this thing that's really perfect and works really well on everybody. So I think talking up human stories is really important. I guess I would also just close by saying that in addition to sort of the harms related to protest, which are like, I think oftentimes more shared, particularly in the United States in the past year, where we saw mass numbers of people really go out to protest. Tools are used for everyday purposes in marginalized communities all the time for ordinary things. And I think bringing up how much of that is like an everyday experience of control is really important to sort of keep talking about. And the line between sort of ordinary like quality of life enforcement and like control of marginalized groups is really important to keep talking up, and how facial recognition plays a role in that. I think there's a really big story of the NYPD running a photo of a Woody Allen, or Woody Harrelson rather, to catch a beer thief at a CVS, or using Photoshop to edit someone's face to add lips that aren't theirs. Like, even if we improve the accuracy of facial recognition, these sort of like use of art projects to continue justifying particular communities being policed is something that we're going to have to keep talking about and keep fighting.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question for that. But first, let me call on Anushka.
I agree with what he just said, that, it is extremely important that public awareness is raised with regard to facial recognition. The thing with facial recognition, it is so invasive, and it has the ability to occur in a manner wherein you will not realize that it has happened, because it can be done through CCTVs, right? So the biggest issue is about public awareness and the public knowing that they are under the gaze of a camera which is capable of facial recognition, as well as in India, the issue that we are facing is a transparency issue, wherein police and the government are putting into place these systems and people don't even know about it, which is why IFF launched Project Panoptic, in which we're currently tracking around 50 ongoing projects all across India wherein we try to provide as much information about the project that we can find through multiple sources. And what you can do is just you can go and look at the map and just click on your state and or your city and try to find out if there is a facial recognition system in your area. You can share that information, you can do something about it. So the biggest thing that is there with regard to facial recognition is that the public needs to understand what is happening, and the authorities need to be more transparent about what they're doing, which they are not currently. So both of these situations are occurring simultaneously, which is something that organizations like us, I'm sure, are working towards solving. So that's what I want to say here.
Thank you. I want to sneak in one last question before we end, and this is a question for Ángel or anyone else who, but inspired by what you said. We have questions from the audience about improving facial recognition technology, right? You were talking about its inadequacies now. People are asking, what about Facebook's more balanced panel of light and dark faces, which might help facial recognition operate better? What about the fact that much facial recognition technology is created in the US, and so it doesn't work as well in other countries? To what extent should we care about fixing technology, facial recognition technology, since it's being used anyhow?
I'll keep it short and let others jump in and say that as a preliminary matter, it shouldn't be used. And so that the first step is just to stop using it. And the fact that it was deployed before, without asking any of these basic questions, just sort of shows, to Anushka's point, the issue with lack of transparency is just that if you have a tech vendor who's trying to sell you something that doesn't work, and you have a police department that wants to sort of use any tool that sounds particularly interesting to them, there's usually no step in the process for anybody to say, wait a second, this has actually worked the way that you think it does. And so the fact that it's already being deployed is like a travesty, needs to be stopped immediately. But improving the technology is not going to address the number of issues that we've already identified on the panel, from the lack of anonymity to the misuse of targeting communities of color and other marginalized groups. So I'll stop there and let others chime in.
Yeah, and just to add, less biased authoritarianism is still authoritarianism, but it will never be unbiased, because even if you take the bias out of the algorithm, there's still the human components that are fueling so much of the inequity in facial recognition. The human discretion in when you're running the facial recognition comparison, the human discretion in which faces go in the comparison database. But also, and we have to keep this in mind, for most police systems, it's not that you're getting some sending in a photo and getting some just like instantaneous results that says this is the person we think we know this is. You're sometimes getting dozens, hundreds of potential quote unquote matches that are supposed to be the person who you say they are, but often aren't. And so even in a less biased facial recognition system, we're going to still see the human bias in how you act on that purported match, how you act on that feedback from the machine. And we'll continue to see that discretion weaponized against communities of color. So there is no, you might theoretically have a non-biased facial recognition algorithm, but you'll never have a non-biased facial recognition system.
Okay, so facial recognition might get technically better, but it'll never get ethically better. Thank you all. This has been From New Delhi to New York, the global state of local facial recognition regulations. Thank you, everyone. And see you again soon for the next STOP event.
Thank you all.
Thank you.